The most mysterious, dark and mysterious stories are not born only in the minds of the greats, to whom, no doubt, can be counted Howard Phillips Lovecraft or Johann Wolfgang Goethe. These stories are generated by the boundary between the subtle world and our own, and from time to time that boundary is blurred and we, the inhabitants of the mortal world, can touch the unexplored. The path is traveled by the one who walks, the goal is reached by the one who seeks. And, as fate would have it, or perhaps someone else's, a lot of these stories did happen to me, which is what this story, and many after it, will be about. It is written from notes and observations that I have always, thanks to my mother, made since childhood. So, let's begin. Exile living in a small town near Moscow, a few tens of kilometers from Moscow, my colleagues, and I rented an office in the central part of it. The building is inconspicuous, two-story, with shabby walls and meaningless plaster. The first floor is for stores, the second for offices, aluminum wiring, a persistent smell of damp and a small parking lot. But fast internet and excellent logistics, any key point could be reached on foot in 5 minutes. The place had one more peculiarity. The janitor Dima. From 5 in the morning in the summer you could always find him with a broom in his hand, or with a broom, with which he cleaned microdust from the sidewalk in front of the store, who paid him a money and periodically fed him. If I had been asked where the cleanest place in town was, I would have pointed without a shred of doubt, or the slightest hesitation, to the playground and sidewalk outside the store. Dima always cleaned there. No one knew where Dima slept or where his house was. He had no passport, and no one asked him for one, and Dima had no need for one. Outwardly he looked like a boy in his 20s, which was characteristic of a certain behavioral way of life, made up of vagrancy, drinking, and sleeping on the chimneys. Dima might have slept there, but the rest of the time he was cleaning outside the store. His face was like a baked apple, always slightly swollen cheeks, eyelids, and cheekbones. Rotten teeth that were rarely seen. Dima, like everyone like him, knew how to smile on his lips, even with his mouth ajar, so that you wouldn't see his teeth. And Dima smiled and laughed all the time. No one knew the color of his hair, or whether he had any hair at all, because even in the bitter cold, and in the unbearable heat, all the good things that nature offers us in the central region, Dima wore a black knit cap. Every man has his own path, and every man has his own tragedy. There was no doubt that Dima had a tragedy, and once, after talking to him, I learned that there really is a tragedy, but it is so insignificant, uninteresting and unimportant, because Dima has a way. That's right, with a capital letter. It happened one day. Walking by, I saw Dima standing outside the store, leaning on his broom. At my joke that the perpetual motion machine battery was dead, he blinked as if he had been brought out of a trance and smiled familiarly. "Oh, it's you. Good afternoon, good afternoon. But there is no such thing as a perpetual motion machine, nor can there be." It was going to be fun, blessing the weather was delightful, it was warm outside, there were no people around, it was lunchtime, and I had a lot of free time, and a burning desire to occupy it. And then there's the intrigue. The local janitor talks about perpetual motion. If you tell anyone, they will laugh at me. But I was so excited about the funny event, that I asked Dima for permission to go to the nearest Burger King for 5 minutes and get a flea bag, and him a hot black tea, and asked him to explain to me, I do not understand the perpetuum mobile. I'll refer back to my notes here. You see, even with a perpetual motion machine, man cannot conquer another galaxy, he just won't get there. Even at the speed of light, which has not yet been reached. You see, the universe is singular. He didn't even get that word confused, and I had to look that definition up on the internet later. It's set up differently, our here and now is not the same as theirs and vice versa, you understand, right? To say that I didn't understand at all what was going on at that moment would be to say nothing. All of my scheduled meetings and talks for the day had become empty and meaningless to me. I had cancelled everything by text message, causing the recipients to resent me. But I didn't care. You know what, Dima? Tell me more about them and about this, what's up with the universe? And Dima told me. Here I give the story as I wrote it down. There, behind the bright quasars, time flows differently, other principles, laws, and energies apply. It is similar to the fact that you feel differently being in the field, immersed a few meters into the water, or being in weightlessness. And even farther away, beyond the dead quasars, the kingdom of Ash is spinning in an endless cosmic waltz. Once upon a time, in the Dark Ages, there was no kingdom, but a galactic system whose inhabitants did not look up to the heavens. 14 planets, and on each of them some forms took life from others in every way they could. With technology that harmonized with the local energies, some planets sent seekers, expeditions whose purpose was to discover other life forms. Needless to say, such encounters did not always end peacefully. The 14 planets were growing in technology, power, and fury. It seemed that their very bowels demanded battle. And more ships went beyond their orbits, never to return. This was not a battle for survival, this was a war of extermination. The land surfaces were transformed into factories and technology parks, the poles into platforms for orbital weapons. The bowels of the planets groaned, becoming weapons of destruction. And the local gods of war kept stoking the fires in their forges. And when every planet, plunged into the abyss of senseless war, was ready to direct all its hatred and technocratic power not against the living but against the planets, dawn came. In an instant, it was as if billions of eyes were opened and stared upward, into the heavens. No, there were no shuttles and shuttles of other civilizations coming down from there, no meteorites falling in a fiery rain, no wave of raging solar neutrinos coming down like a devouring wall. No. The sky opened the thin borders of worlds and all the memories of thousands and thousands of generations fell upon the heads of those watching. Their fathers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers returned to the surface of the planets, from thousands of years of confinement. They returned not bodily, they returned with knowledge, with wisdom and sorrow. They came down to their sons and spoke to them. It was as if the fetters that held souls together had collapsed, and everyone began to hear everyone, everyone became a part of the common consciousness. Like an enormous cauldron capable of feeding an entire troop of warriors, the awareness that came was able to feed everyone on the 14 planets. Protoplasmic, neural, and bosonic implements were thrown into the crucibles from which they emerged. And even the planets themselves seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. Princess United knowledge, coupled with a shared consciousness aimed at creation rather than destruction, at cooperation rather than expansion and destruction, could not in such short periods of time heal the bleeding wounds of the planets, but the celestial bodies themselves seemed to have come to their senses and thrown all their energies into recovery. The terrible scars were closing, and parks and nature reserves soon grew up where the factories had been noisy. Guided by the stream of general consciousness, the rays of illumination soon reached the farthest corners of the nearest stars. The bright age had come. Wars and strife were forgotten, battle cruisers were melted down, and antimatter and interstellar annihilators now served peaceful purposes. And in the light age, the ancestors remained with their heirs from the 14 planets. Having not gained bodies after the reunion, they could not be helpers in the grand rebirth, but their love for their sons, and their desire to be of benefit to them. As clots of pure. Here Dima stumbled, the nearest word would be energy, but that's like saying Da Vinci could draw. So, being clots of pure energy, they obeyed the same singular laws. Which means that time and distance did not exist for them. The ancestors helped their descendants to create sarcophagi, a transport that could overcome any distance, through the mole holes. The price for this was the ancestors' voluntary imprisonment inside the sarcophagus, a fusion of soul and machine. And the death of one led to the imminent death of the other. Ultimate death. Both ancestors and descendants knew this, but even the absolute knowledge bestowed by Zarias could not answer the question of what happened next. But the sarcophagi have always returned. Gradually, evolving and improving, unaware of war, devastation, hunger, disease and death, society received another gift. These were the children. The last generation, as they called it. They were different from the rest. They managed, like the ancestors, to travel outside space and dimensions, while leaving their physical shells under the strict supervision of the guardians, an order headed by the mothers of the 14 planets. And the very last of the last generation, the princess was born. Everyone knew it was her. And then all 14 worlds, the dusky Horus, the blooming planet Shalot, and the inhabitants of deserted Galio all knelt before her. The age of the kingdom of Ash had come. Then Dima stopped talking. "I have to sweep, I'm sorry." He turned away and concentrated on sweeping dust off the sidewalk. Dima wasn't smiling anymore that day. I thought I even saw a tear glisten in the corner of his eye. We didn't speak to each other again that day. I was under the impression for at least 2 or even 3 days, and I reread the notes a couple of times. It was either a book I hadn't read or a movie I hadn't seen. But Diminutive's story was so detailed, so sensual and frank, that even despite the inherent cynicism of people of my craft, that I doubted my own speculation. I decided to take a break, and for a couple of weeks I greeted Dima with just a nod of my head, avoiding any discussion with him. But Dima didn't insist. He concentrated on chalking the street. And he wasn't smiling at all now. After that couple of weeks, I sort of happened to be passing by and called him out, to which Dima said politely, "Dima, remind me what date and day of the week it is, because in my hustle and bustle I forgot." Dima scratched his head with a broomstick. "Yes, I do not know myself. I know that it is summer," and proud of this conclusion was going back to his work. "Dim, but remind me, you spoke about one of the planets and called it Duskyates. What's its?" I snapped my fingers picturesquely. "Chorus," Dima said quietly and very seriously. "It's like that because of atmospheric formations, neutrinos don't penetrate there." I've been all over the internet, googling all said names, concepts, situations. Not even close. For a while, my surroundings lost their colors, and for the rest of the day I asked Dima about Ash, the ancestors, and interstellar expeditions. And Dima told me the second part of his story. The story of the beginning of the epoch of the sunset. Dima belonged to the last generation. Naturally, his name was not Dima, and when I asked him about it, he looked at me in surprise and explained the name is the only thing that cannot give absolute knowledge. To entrust it to whom is to merge destinies, and it can only be done once. Therefore, no matter how much I ask, it cannot be done. The last time names were uttered to their chosen ones were by the mothers of the last generation. But just as the sun always sets, so after the Renaissance, the age of the sunset began. Not all of the last generation thought absolute knowledge was a good thing. For the universal good is tantamount to its absence. But being the last and considering themselves superior to the descendants, they felt in themselves the power to change everything. And the dark knowledge was given to them. It was as simple as a number and as ruthless as the last curse of a victim. And the last used it. Soaring out of their bodies into eternity, they began to slay the ancestors, one by one. And the final destruction was painful in the hearts of the inhabitants of the 14 planets. And dawn began to leave the kingdom. The less ancestors remained, the faster the absolute knowledge left the hearts and minds of the inhabitants of Ash. And only the light of the princess, like a beacon in the middle of the storm, held back the newly revived and forgotten hatred. But not all of the last have followed the path of dark knowledge. Feeling the cracking of the foundations of creation, those few who remained loyal to the throne, the ancestors and the princess, decided to make the sacrifice. My interlocutor, who never revealed his true name to me, ripped the hearts out of a brother, one of the last ones who had gone on the hunt for the ancestor. A brother whose body, under the watchful guard of his mother, rested in one of the shelters. Walking the path of dark knowledge, they found themselves becoming prey themselves. But it was too late. The moaning and shrieking mothers were dragged away from the smoking remains of their sons. And when the followers of the dark path were gone, the dawning returned to illuminate the realm once more. Thus, the remnants of the last have accomplished the greatest feat and committed the greatest transgression. The dawn of the Absolute returned to the kingdom, but in order to shine, the kingdom first had to be cleansed of those on whose hands the blood of their brethren smoldered. And so the last were transformed into outcasts. Their bodies were imprisoned in cryotombs on satellite planets, and their souls were shackled and entrusted to sarcophagi that would carry them far, far beyond the bright quasars. As the last were placed in their resting place, a thin hand lay on the cryo chamber door, and a voice whispered goodbye, it was the princess, tears glistening in her eyes. For only recently she and my interlocutor had told each other their true names. And here I am, not remembering or knowing anything, only what I've heard from the people around me. No past, no present. I only remember her. And I'm waiting for her to forgive me and for us to meet. Dima wasn't smiling. It was hard for me to call him Dima either. I kept seeing the picture in my mind's eye: a cave, a giant hall, and the farewell of the last and the last. And tragedy too. After that story, Dima and I never spoke again. We closed the office and left for another city to new projects, people and victories. And Dima stayed to sweep the street. Epilogue: a year later, I returned to N, and decided to take a walk through its center, and, without noticing it, I turned into a familiar alleyway and came out to a familiar place. By that time all this story had already been washed away, and the news, books and reviews had been added to it, but when I set foot in a familiar street the colors brightened again. There was no Dima outside the store. Slamming the door, I crossed the threshold, said hello to the owner, and asked where their best worker was. He shrugged his shoulders and said no one had seen him in over 6 months. Maybe somebody poached him, or maybe he moved to another city. But my gut told me that this was not the case. And gut instincts rarely deceive beasts. As a detective friend told me, they found him, Dima, in one of the basements, under a pile of old newspapers. The forensics diagnosed a cardiac arrest, so that there was no grouse, and so the reasons are not clear. Yes, and not interesting, he added. And you know what is strange? I haven't seen it myself, I've been told. They get him, and he's smiling ear to ear. Can you imagine? He's a stiff, but he's smiling. After patting him on the shoulder and thanking him, I left the office. For me there was nothing strange about it. I know the reason for this smile. It's just that Dima went back to the princess.